Hello everyone, this is Dr. Sangeeta Chaudhary again and I welcome everyone to my lecture class. In my today's class, I'm going to discuss about the basics of acid-base disorder. There are various acid-base disorders and it is not possible to describe the whole in a single class. So I will be describing these disorders in different small classes or small lectures. So today just let's know what are the acid, what is base and how the balance of acid and base is maintained in our body. So initially, just know about the terminologies. Acid. What is an acid? Acid is a substance that can donate H plus ion. I'm trying to describe it in very easy terminology. So, acid when added to solution, it raises H plus ion. So basically, acid is something which increases the H plus ion concentration in the blood. What is base? Base is something which can accept H plus ion. And when added to solution, it lowers the H plus ion concentration. So base, actually it does exactly the opposite of an acid. So base lowers H plus ion concentration in blood, whereas acid, it raises H plus ion concentration in blood. Now there is something known as pK or pKa. What is it? It is the pH at which half of the compound is ionized. Now, strong acids would have a pK of less than 3. This is important. And strong base, they would have a pK of more than 9. So, this is about pK or pKa. pH, basically pH signifies the free hydrogen ion concentration. Increase in pH means H plus ion is decreasing and decrease in pH means H plus ion is increasing, right? So, this is the easy understanding of what is pH. Now, acidosis, when we call it as acidosis or acidemia, when the pH of arterial blood is less than 7.35, we call it as acidosis. The normal pH range is in between 7.35 to 7.45. When it is below 7.35, it is known as, or it is designated as acidosis, and when it is more than 7.45, that is known as alkalosis. So this is about acidosis and alkalosis. Now, why pH is so important? Okay, small changes in pH can produce major disturbances in our body. So pH has always to be maintained in a very narrow range, that is 7.35 to 7.45 for arterial blood. Most enzymes function only with narrow pH range. So when the pH is increased or the pH is decreased, the enzymatic function becomes hampered. Acid-base balance can also affect electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chloride. They can be affected by the imbalance of acid and base. And they can also affect the function of hormones. So it is very important to maintain the pH at a very narrow range, okay, so that different enzymes and different hormones can function properly and the balance of different electrolytes also remains maintained. So this is the importance of maintaining pH. Now, from this diagram, we can see that this is a normal value of pH, that is 7.35 to 7.45, and we have already discussed if pH falls below 7.35, it is known as acidosis, and if pH increases by more than 7.45, it is known as alkalosis. And this is the pH range for a person to survive. This is also known as the survival range of pH. What is a buffer? Okay, buffer, what does it do? Buffer is a combination of a weak acid and or a weak base and its salt. Okay, this is what a buffer is. And what does it do? It resists changes in pH. That means buffer is something which tries to maintain the pH in its normal range. It tries to resist the change in pH. So this is the importance of a buffer. And the effectiveness of buffer, it depends on the pK of buffering system. We have already discussed what pK is. Okay, pK is the pH at which a compound remains 50% ionized. pH of environment in which it is placed, this is also important for the buffer to function, right? So this is the function of buffer and the importance of buffer. Okay, now Let's talk about the buffer system in our body. Chemical buffer system and physiological buffer. We have already known that buffer is something which tries to prevent the change in acid, or which tries to maintain the pH of our body within a narrow range. So first line of defense against the change in pH is chemical buffer system. And in the chemical buffer system, we have bicarbonate buffer system, phosphate buffer system, and protein buffer system. So bicarbonate, phosphate, and protein, they act as important chemical buffer, which are the first line of defense against pH shift. Now, second line of defense against pH change or pH shift is physiological buffers. So it is very important. Physiological buffers include respiratory mechanism, which deals with the CO2 excretion or CO2 retention, and the renal mechanism, H plus excretion. So this is about the buffer system. Chemical buffers, first line of defense, and physiological buffers, that is second line of defense. There is something known as Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. What is it? It shows the relationship between pH and the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system in the plasma. The relation between a pH and the buffer, that is bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer system, is it is designated with the equation, Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. And it allows us to calculate the pH. This is the equation. How we can calculate the pH, also known as Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. Now, basically in this class, we are going to talk about the physiological buffer system and how does they function. So, physiological buffer systems include respiratory mechanisms and renal mechanism. So, respiratory mechanisms or lungs, what they do? It is the quickest way to respond. It takes minutes to hours to correct the pH. So, this is the fastest responsive, physiological buffer, which tries to correct the pH within minutes to hours. What does respiratory system do? It eliminates volatile respiratory acids such as carbon dioxide. When there is accumulation of carbon dioxide in our body, it forms carbonic acid, so acidity increases. So lungs tries to excrete or eliminate the carbon dioxide from the body. It does not affect fixed acids like lactic acid. Body pH can be adjusted by changing rate and depth of breathing. So if there is increase in respiration, increased respiratory rate, increased depth of breathing, there will be carbon dioxide washout from the body, and then because of the carbon dioxide washout, there will be decreased acid level in the blood. But if there is retention of carbon dioxide, if the respiratory rate is slow, depth is slow, then there will be retention of carbon dioxide in the body, which will ultimately lead to respiratory acidosis. Right? Physiological buffer system, coming to kidney or metabolic buffer system. What does kidney do? It can eliminate large amount of acids from body. It can excrete base as well. That means in times of need, it can excrete acid in large amounts, or in times of need, it can excrete base as well. But it takes several hours to days to correct pH. Whereas we have seen that respiratory system takes minutes to hours to correct the pH, but kidney takes hours, several hours to days to correct the pH. And it is the most effective regulator of pH. If kidney fails, pH balance fails. So it is very important to take good care of kidney. Now, if we talk about the acid-base imbalances, what is it? The body responds to acid-base imbalance, It is called as compensation. That means whenever there is any imbalance between the acid and base, our body tries to compensate for it. That is known as the compensatory mechanism or compensation. And there comes the function of buffer. It may be complete if brought back within normal limits. Means compensation can be complete if the physiological buffer system and chemical buffer system, they are functioning very well. Then the compensation can be complete, and then the pH can be brought back to within the normal range. Partial compensation, when you call as partial compensation, if the range is still outside the normal range, means if pH is not brought back to the normal limit, then it is known as the partial compensation. Now, if underlying problem is metabolic, suppose if it is metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, then respiratory system will act as the buffer system. So if the underlying problem is metabolic, then hyperventilation or hypoventilation can help. This is the respiratory compensation. If there is metabolic acidosis, suppose there is metabolic acidosis, then there will be hyperventilation, so that body will try to wash out the carbon dioxide from the body. But suppose if there is metabolic alkalosis, then what respiratory system will do? Respiratory system will try to conserve carbon dioxide in the body as a compensatory mechanism, okay, by hypoventilation. If problem is respiratory, renal mechanisms can bring about metabolic compensation, okay. And if the problem is respiratory, then renal mechanism will come into action. That means if there is respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, then kidney will come into action for compensation, which is known as metabolic compensation. That means if the problem is metabolic, lung will act as compensatory mechanism, and if the problem is respiratory, then kidney will compensate for it. Okay, so this is the easy understanding of the physiological buffer system and how do they work. So when H plus ion concentration increases, it lowers the pH. That means there is acidosis. This already we have known, and it may be as a result of accumulation of acid in the body or loss of base from the body. This will help us to know different causes of acid-base disorder. So if any cause leading to accumulation of acids or loss of base will ultimately result in increase in H plus ion concentration, which will lower the pH, thereby resulting in acidosis. Okay, just opposite happens in case of alkalosis. If there is loss of acids or accumulation of base, it will result in reduction in H plus ion, okay, and it will lead to increase in pH, which is known as alkalosis. So what may be the cause of alkalosis? Any cause which leads to loss of acids from the body or accumulation of base in the body may result in alkalosis. Okay, so this was all about the basics of acid-base imbalance and how the buffer system acts in our body to compensate for the acid-base disorders. I hope this class was helpful. Thank you so much for listening.